To understand the future, we have to understand one fundamental truth, that technology is natural and nature is technological. If we understand that, if we follow that narrative all the way through from our primordial beginnings to the future and where we're headed, you'll understand that we are living in a false narrative. We live in the false narrative that we are human beings, when in fact, we're nature. We are nature. And if you follow that philosophy, if you follow that train of thought and that narrative, you'll start to see that there are specific emerging technologies that have been with us from the very beginning. And one of those is the mirror. The mirror has been with us since the beginning, when we used dark clay pots and little pools of still water that we could see ourselves. And that was the first time we really saw ourselves, was staring into a pond or staring into a little clay pot with water in it. Follow that through to ancient Greece and Egypt when it was polished bronze. Those devices weren't necessarily perfect. They weren't clear. So the individual was still slightly wobbly, and your reflection would sort of be a monstrous version of who you really were, or your reflection at least. Then you get into the 1300s where mirrors become more advanced. And then you get into the 1800s where mirrors start to be prevalent throughout culture. That changed what it meant to be a human being. It changed what it meant to be a natural byproduct of the earth, which is where we came from. Suddenly, instead of being a part of nature or a part of a community, we became an individual. We had an individual reflection. She's more beautiful than she is. He's more beautiful than he is. What you start to see is that you start to see this individual consciousness emerge within cultures around the world. You start to see the idea of privacy in communities. You start to see the idea of moving away from communal living into individual living. And if you follow that through up to where we are now, which is in the phase of the digital mirror, which is where we are right now, you see that there's an epidemic of isolation that the digital mirror has caused. And the reason, I think, is because it's not just a metallic surface that's reflecting the truth of what we look like, or the truth of our individual selves, or even our culture. What we're seeing is a reflection that's augmented and manipulated. Now we are in the era of the digital mirror, and in this time period, the reflection is manipulated. The reflection is augmented. And so the individual is also less a part of the community, because the individual has complete autonomous control over its reflection, if that makes sense. So each individual, instead of just having a truthful reflection of who they are using the traditional mirror, the digital mirror allows us to Photoshop ourselves, manipulate ourselves with apps. That augmentation that's starting to take place within the digital mirror is also causing us to be even more isolated, because now we have a choice to see ourselves however we want, making us less a part of any individual community and more a part of the individual and isolated self. So the question is really, is this a natural evolutionary process that we're going through? And the answer, if you follow that narrative that we are nature, the answer has to be yes. That's a very painful truth that we're having to learn right now, is that the false narrative that we've been given by philosophers throughout history and religions throughout history is that we are somehow divine. And in fact, we're not. We are just a part of this natural system that's evolving on this planet. I mean, we are a byproduct of a rock floating through the cosmos. I think it was Alan Watts that said once, "Wherever there are rocks, watch out, there will be people." The planet itself, nature itself, is reflective. We live on a water world, basically. We live on a planet where the most natural emergent technology was a reflection. Nature has been trying to tell us from the very beginning that our future would be reflective, that our future would be simulated, that our future would be mirrored and mimicked. And so if you understand that, if you understand that where we're headed is towards not only digitization, but we're headed towards a reflection of reality. That simulations are in our future, that digital reflection is in our future, that the ultimate form and the ultimate truth of nature itself, which is the fractal, is where we're headed. So that idea that we are headed towards fractal reflection in the future, that we are headed towards fractal simulation in the future, should tell us that more than likely this is not the first time that we've done this. This may not be the original reality, because it seems that nature intends, if nature can have an intention, it seems that nature intends to reflect. Terence McKenna used to call this the novelty feature of nature, that nature is a novelty preserving engine, that it preserves novelty. But I think, and also Terence talked about the attractor at the end of time, that we were being pulled into the future by some object or idea or thing in the future. But see, I think the word attractor was the wrong thing. I think what he was trying to describe, instead of the attractor at the end of time, is the reflection at the end of time. I think that's where we're being pulled. We're being pulled towards our own reflection. And when I say our, I don't mean humanity. I mean nature and the cosmos and whatever that really is. The cosmos itself is being pulled toward reflection in the future. So ultimately, as I've said before, ultimately, whether this is a simulation or not, that is where we're headed. We are headed towards ultimate reflection. We are headed to a place beyond the digital mirror. We are headed to a place where any reality is possible. Any reflection is possible. Any mimicry is possible, where the individual has control, ultimate control over not only their physical reflection, but their reality reflection. Any system that we're creating right now, if you really look at AI and algorithms, you're going to find a similar pattern in nature to how those systems are developed. It may not seem apparent at first, but when you really look at how they're developing, like GANs, generative adversarial networks, they're using competing reflections, let's put it that way. They're using competing reflections to come up with the ultimate answer or solution, or reflection. They're coming up with the ultimate reflection. And maybe that's what's happening. I mean, that's sort of a fractal system of what the simulation will look like in the future, where we've talked about this before, where the individual simulation, the individual digital mirror in the future, the reflection that is in that feedback loop that we get when we look into the digital mirror right now it already gives us ultimate control. We can augment it, manipulate it, retouch it, digitize it, and send that out into the world. And there is some creativity of the individual. There is some essence of the individual built into that, because then you do get people who are interested in being cats versus being dragons versus being robots. So there is some individual left in that augmentation of the digital self and the digital reflection, but it's not truth. It's not looking into a pool of water. It's not looking into a polished piece of bronze. The original mirror is showing you a truthful reflection, or at least as truthful as any individual consciousness can tolerate. But a simulated reflection, which is where we're headed, which is, again, what it seems nature seems to be pulling us towards, simulated reflection in the future. Whether that reflected system is a local system because we live on a water world, or whether that or whether we find that kind of reflective behavior throughout the cosmos, which I think we probably will, because again, the system itself, nature itself, seems to be a fractal producing system. So what we find in any lower system, we're going to find in a higher system. Anything you find in nature, you're going to find eventually in AI. You will see reflections of the natural source code in anything that we develop, because we're pulling from nature. I mean, our brains are a byproduct of nature, so anything that emerges out of our brains is going to be a product of natural code. It's going to be a reflection of nature itself. So this idea of far future, the simulated reflection that we're maybe moving towards, being pulled towards, that is the ultimate control system. That is the ultimate reflected system, because within that system, it's not just a reflection of the individual, it's a reflection of every individual. And for the very first time, we can see ourselves not only as the other sees us, but we can see through the other how they're seeing us, if that makes sense. So in the future, I would expect that we would be able to see ourselves through the consciousness of other people. And that, we're sort of starting to see that right now with the digital mirror. We're starting to see how the world sees us by the way that we reflect. So I actually think that's why you're seeing such grave isolation. And also on the other side, the positive side, you're seeing really bad behaviors finally being worked out. We're just at the beginning of working out some of our most primal behaviors. The Me Too movement, fascism, hopefully the end of fascism, racism, income inequality. All of these things are coming to the surface. There's the idea. All these things are coming to the surface to be seen, because we are finally at a stage where we can reflect globally and not just locally, if that makes sense. There's a really profound question that needs to be answered here, and you hear this a lot with developers when they're creating AI, is what is our utility function? What is the utility function not only for human beings, but on a more holistic level, what is the utility function for nature itself? What is the purpose that nature is driving us towards? And it seems that the nature and the utility function of nature is to reflect.